Let there be light.
And the mountains were formed out of hot glue and foil. For my sculpt, I mean, God used higher quality materials for the real ones. Hey friends, this is Holy Cow Creates, and today, for Boyle A Hobby's Ancient History Art Challenge, I am going to be making a Noah's Ark diorama. First, I'll be sculpting a mountain range, then pouring resin until all the mountains are completely covered with floodwaters, and topping it off with a tiny ark. I've also tried to give this video a certain mood, which I hope you'll enjoy. In addition to foil, I'm using old ruined clay that isn't good for actual projects anymore. The more you can build up the base of your sculpts with filler, the less expensive clay you have to use. This top sheet of clay was rolled through a pasta machine, and now I'm rolling over it with ball styluses to make it conform to the shapes I've built up underneath. In order to make sure the clay sheet adheres to the chipboard base, I'm applying some liquid clay. I've sculpted the mountain based loosely off of modern-day Mount Ararat in Turkey. Whether this is actually the same Mount Ararat the Bible says the Ark settled on after the flood doesn't really matter, because even if it was, I'm sure that the erosion during and after the flood changed the topography of the mountain significantly, not to mention changes to the mountain since then. So even if it's the same mountain, it surely doesn't look the same now as it did then. But I had to use something as a reference, so why not Mount Ararat? I chose to make a Noah's Ark diorama that showed mountains underneath the floodwaters because I wanted to emphasize the scale of the flood. I wanted to focus less on the sometimes romanticized idea of the animals marching onto the ark as couples and then the pretty rainbow at the end, but instead highlight the awesome power and the sobering destruction and loss of life that God unleashed through the flood. Once I've established this solid layer of clay, now it's all about refining the shape and then adding texture using actual rocks to make it look more realistically mountainous. Can you imagine what it was like being Noah, anticipating the coming destruction, the years leading up to the flood?
The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart were only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them.
I'm using a technique called dry brushing with a light gray paint on the areas I've already painted to highlight the details of the high points on the model. Meanwhile, this black wash, which at first looks like too much, Once dabbed off, does the exact opposite of dry brushing. It makes the recessed areas darker, adding more detail and contrast. It looks like too much, but it's watered down so it will dry lighter. This painting doesn't need to be perfect because it will be covered with moss and then later completely buried in the resin floodwaters. After the black wash, I repainted the snow caps and then used a wet Q-tip to blend the edge of the snow. Now I'm processing moss from a previous project to use as foliage surrounding the mountain. Having this big bag of moss hanging around comes in handy, as well as a lot of other natural materials. I highly recommend you building up such a library yourself out of materials from nature. It's cheaper than buying materials and often produces a more realistic result. I'm also adding some static grass to the mix. This is just supposed to look like a satellite view of green earth, so it doesn't have to look like a specific type of flora. Originally, I thought of making a village surrounding the mountain and maybe floating debris, but I thought that detail would get lost in the final result, so I opted for a simpler approach. I'm applying Mod Podge in order to glue down the moss mixture. After the moss is added, I need to seal it. First, I spray the sculpt with isopropyl alcohol. This breaks the surface tension when dabbling on the watered down glue. Here you can see what happens when an area isn't sprayed with alcohol. The watered down glue is just beating up on top instead of sinking in.
But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. So God said to Noah, I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood, make rooms in it and coat it with pitch inside and out. Noah did everything just as God commanded him.
Initially, when sculpting and 3D printing the Ark, I measured the distance between the major and minor peaks of Mount Ararat and compared it to Google's estimation of the size of the Ark. Unfortunately, that worked out to be smaller than a single centimeter. I tried 3D printing the Ark at this size, but it was so small I couldn't find it in the vat of resin. I tried scaling it up so that it might still be feasibly within the range of the original Ark size, but big enough to print, but it was still only the size of a grain of rice. So I just gave up on realistic scale. You can see my first attempt the size of a grain of rice, and then several subsequent attempts where the top of the Ark never printed. Here's the final Ark I printed, where you can get the sense of scale. It's still only the size of my fingernail, which made it hard to paint all the details.
In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the second month, on that day, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were open, and rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. On that very day, Noah and his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth, together with his wife, and the wives of his 3 sons, entered the ark. They had with them every wild animal according to its kind. Then the Lord shut him in. 40 days the flood kept coming on the earth, and as the waters increased, they lifted the ark high above the earth. The waters rose and increased greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered to a depth of more than 15 cubits. Every living thing that moved on land perished. Only Noah was left.
For the ocean waves on top of the resin, I use this Woodland Scenics water waves effect. When first applied, it's too liquid to hold shape, so you have to wait to the perfect moment when it's half cured so it's still workable, but not too soft. This was really difficult to get right. This was one of the longer, more time-consuming parts of this project, which I have heavily abbreviated in the editing because it was kind of repetitive. I wasn't entirely sure how rough I wanted the waves to be, or what the waves would even look like if the water level was above even the highest mountains. I'd guessed that high up there's more wind, and with the water so deep with no coastlines, the waves would be much bigger and more uniform. Given the size of Mount Ararat, the waves I sculpted are gigantic. For my first try at water effects and waves, I think it's a good accomplishment. For the foam and froth on top of the waves, I tried a mixture of silica sand, Mod Podge, and white paint. I found it looked better later when I added dish soap and more of the Woodland Scenics water effects. In the future, I would add less paint so that it dried a little more translucent. I may have added a bit too much foam, but again, these are really rough seas, so I imagine it could be more frothy than what we're used to seeing. Now I'm clearing off some of the foam for a spot to put the ark, then embedding it there with some more water gel. Felt these waves were a little too uniform, so I'm breaking them up a little with peaks and valleys in between the crests. Now I'm building storm clouds using polyester stuffing. Using a torch, I can melt any stray strands so that my clouds don't look hairy. In the future, I would use cotton, or maybe wool and needle felting for better results. I'm spraying my bunched up collection of polyester balls with watered down glue, hoping they'll stick together better. Now it's time to airbrush the cloud to make it look more like storm clouds full of rain. I'm still new to airbrushing, so I had a lot of trouble with it, but I found out later that the problems were caused by a part I hadn't cleaned well enough the last time getting stuck. Finally, I soaked some dark blue tissue paper in watered down glue to cover the top of my clouds. This way, if I flash a light through the clouds, it'll look more blue like lightning, as well as helping hold the cloud together. Using UV resin, I'm gluing on these clear acrylic rods to help hold up the rain clouds. These twist ties will keep the clouds from falling down and allow me to adjust the height of the cloud as needed.
The waters flooded the earth for 150 days. see if the water had receded from the surface of the ground. As soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him.